Hello and welcome to this episode of the Hessian Scrum. Joining me today is Antonio from Cóndor. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, man.
Yeah, so you're on the back of Aurë Entuluva. Great release, really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And there's a lot to discuss with this one. A lot has changed since El Valle del Cóndor. Think it's been quite a while. So first of all, tell us why was there such a long break between both releases?
Okay, so the band was actually over for a while. Right before we put out El Valle del Cóndor, which was November 2018, Francisco, one of the other guitar players, who's also the other songwriter, he left the band. So we released the album sort of post-mortem, but we didn't really announce it that the band was over. Uh, I'm not sure why. We tried to carry on as a four-piece, but it didn't work. And so the band was over for years. And then about 2 years ago, year and a half ago, Francisco and I started sending each other music. We were still writing music, it just wasn't Cóndor music. But then we were sending each other music and we were like, this is Cóndor. This is Cóndor music. And so the band restarted. That's why there was such a long time.
Yeah. And because it feels like with El Valle del Condor, you guys went in a really kind of more of a power metal di direction, which was kind of different to what you guys were doing on Sangreal, Nadia, Doing, etc. And here you with Ore and Tuluva, you kind of came back to that main Condor style.
Yeah, I think Doing also has a little bit of that, like sort of a more concentrated heavy metal or even power metal songwriting. I think, we write a proggy album and we get bored with the proggy stuff, so we write a simpler album and it goes back and forth. I think that's what's happened many times. But those influences that like, yeah, power metal, I'm not going to be afraid of that term. That music has always been a big influence, both the US stuff, which we discovered, I think, around the time of doing, but also just the European stuff, which, as a South, in South America, it's very popular. We grew up with it and we still love it. So,
And definitely. And but here on one of the big differences, like it feels like the production values have gone up quite a bit. The playing is much cleaner. The solos are a lot more complex. What happened during that time?
well, a few things. First of all, in those 7 years that the band was inactive, uh, I actually went into the music business professionally. Me and Luis, the guy who has produced all of our albums, we started a studio, and so we've worked in a lot of stuff. We've worked on a lot of even mainstream productions. We've worked on a lot of movie soundtracks, stuff like that. So we sort of the naivete of the past is gone, because we now know how things are done, which is obviously not how we want to do them with Condor, but we now have the knowledge and the equipment and the time. So even though a lot of people still think the production isn't that good, but it's by choice this time. Everything we do this time was conscientious. Whereas in the past, there was a bit of like the first album was recorded in a bedroom with four mics, like it was sort of a circumstance thing. This time, everything is by choice. And we had a lot of time because since the band isn't really an active band, we don't play live. Francisco isn't living in the country. So the album took like a year and a half to make, which was not good in a way, but it also gave us time to, sort of re-record takes. And we were always a little bit rushed in the past, in all the albums, there's playing stuff that isn't right. There's like, if I could have redone that take, I would have redone that take. Uh, this time there isn't any of that. you know?
Yeah, but you still kept this kind of a very Latin American style of production overall, right?
Yeah, you could say. I mean, the thing is, we're into all kinds of metal, but I think, especially at the beginning, but still now, like our heart is very much in the extreme underground of black metal. Like what we do with Siete Lagunas, and that production style to us has a magic. Like that sort of the shitty guitar sound, especially, and the drums not being too loud. Like I can't. It's the end, it's the beginning of 2026. So I've been going through year-end lists, and most of the stuff I can't listen to just because the drums are so loud and everything is like, we use a click track now, but everything is so obviously click tracked. Like it's just, I can't connect with that. And I think none of us can. So that's why we keep that sort of looseness to the style, you know?
But then because a lot of the parts are quite complex in that there's always like two lead guitars going on. I do think that early at the gates was probably a very big influence for you guys.
Huge.
So it must be quite a bit of a balancing act getting all these different elements going on and still retaining that kind of grit.
Yeah, and I think we hadn't quite achieved it. I think in this record, I'm not it's not perfect, of course, but I think we finally managed to have clarity, to have the style of production that we like mostly, but with every part being understandable, especially the three guitars. That's the biggest challenge, because there's these three instruments that are in the same frequency range, fully distorted 90% of the time. Obviously, it's a challenge, and it's a challenge that for the first time, I think we started thinking about from the composition stage. When we were writing the music, we were like, how the fuck are we going to mix this? So since we started thinking about it earlier on, I think that helped.
Definitely. Um, in terms of songwriting here as well, it feels like you guys are trying to get away more and more from the idea of the riff, the repeated 4x4 riff, right?
Absolutely. I mean, look, I love riffs, who doesn't? But eventually, like, unless the riff is just that good, we don't like to just play it four times. I think the way we think about it is, like every other metal band, I think you're messing around in your guitar and you happen upon a riff most of the time. So it happens to you. And then I think standard procedure is to play that riff four times and then see what happens after.
Mm.
What we try to do, at least, it depends on the part of the song, but what we try to do is that 4 bar riff, that 6 bar riff, that 2 bar riff is the first statement of a 16 or 24 bar phrase. Like the first, which is how it works in classical music and in a lot of the more ambitious death metal classics. Like obviously we have riffs that just go four times. Sometimes that's what you need. Like after a solo or something, you just need a riff. But yeah, we are definitely, I wouldn't say trying to escape the riff, but trying to kind of like have it be a building block for a melody, not so much the end itself.
Yeah, because it's only really on La Muerte de Jose Maria Cordova that you guys really go for a more traditional riff-based approach, which is quite a bit of a shock on the album, right? Compared to the first two
Yeah,
tracks.
that's why we put it in the middle, because it was kind of the odd one out. It was faster, it was shorter, and it was more riff based. That song is 90% Francisco, who is of the two songwriters, me and him, probably the more traditionally heavy metal oriented one. Um, so I did tweak it to make it more Cóndor, but it's riff fest. But even those riffs, I think, there's only a few of them that just go four times in a sort of like traditional way. But in the other songs, we use that as an effect, like, so there's a complex section and there's a solo and there's all this stuff and you kind of need to breathe. So in comes the riff, it's sort of like we're trying to make it one more tool in the toolbox.
Yeah. See exactly what I mean. Because I noticed on previous releases, especially like the first epic on Sangreal, for example, there's already that kind of it's starting to happen where you're not really repeating riffs 4 times. Sometimes it could be five, sometimes three, whatever. It starts to get, but it's not quite as pushed. Was that always something that you had since the beginning of Cóndor?
I don't know if the beginning, but definitely from Sangreal. I think after doing when we decided to, call up Jorge and be three guitar players, there was that ambition. I think that was our time when I personally, and I think Francisco as well, was most obsessed with classical music and with Bach in particular, and Buxtehude and sort of like high Baroque, very like counterpoint dense music. And so we wanted to do that, but keep it metal, not sort of become like distortion Bach, which is very interesting. And so I think from there we kind of started to try to head in that direction. And obviously that changed a lot of things. Everything was written out beforehand. We had to resort to the click track because it's a little much for a band that doesn't rehearse because we don't rehearse, you know.
I mean, has that always been the kind of the way the band worked? You write the songs, you record them, and if you happen to play a live show, you happen to play a live show.
That's how it's always happened because when the band started, I was living abroad. And then now Francisco is living abroad. So, the band happens when it can, you know.
Yeah, definitely. I spoke to Rainer. He told me he'd recorded the bass in one day, and then he moved like 2 days or whatever.
Oh man, Rainer. Yeah. Well, Rainer, actually, the way it went is I had written these songs. Nadia is mostly my writing except for the instrumental. I had written the songs and I had just demoed them in a little practice amp in my room. And I got together with him one day and he wrote the parts that day. And then the next day he recorded them. And then he moved to Mexico. Yeah, that's kind of always how it's worked.
And definitely, I mean, let's go into the lyrics because you guys use three languages. Well, at least throughout your releases that I can count.
Mm.
Spanish, of course, English, and then for some reason, the local language here, Languedoc Occitan.
Occitan, ouais. Yeah.
I
Well,
mean,
so Spanish, obviously,
yeah,
that's our language.
but
And then,
why
sorry.
all these languages?
Well, I think it's similarly to how we think about metal subgenres. Like we don't really see any of those things as a limiting factor. Like, oh, we have to sing in this language. Obviously, we sing mostly in Spanish, not only because it's our language and the one we're obviously going to write best in, but because the whole concept of the band is centered around the country, around Colombia for the most part. So it has to be in Spanish. The Occitan came in because we were in a period of like we were really into the Middle Ages, like really into, and because Ezra Pound, we both got into Occitan because Ezra Pound called it like the poetic language of Europe. So we were like, oh, if Ezra Pound says this, and we got super into it, and we got super into those sort of like troubadour medieval poems and Bertrand des Bornes and all this stuff. And so I think the idea first came to like, all right, let's use this Bertrand des Bornes poem on that song, Outremer. And then because that record has a few like crusader kind of themes. And then I decided to try to write a song in Occitan, which is Sancaral. And I'm not entirely sure it's all correct, but and then the English, we had always resisted English, because it was a Colombian project, whatever. But we love Yeats, and we were instead of doing a shitty translation of the Yeats, we're like, well, let's just use the Yeats.
Right. Because yeah, La Última Carceria, yeah, you did
Mhm.
that in English, yeah, which is literally
Yeah,
a Yeats poem, yeah.
it's just the Yeats poem. Yeah.
But that's very interesting because despite being a kind of Colombian project, and I've even seen reviewers say, "Oh, this is all about Colombian stuff," but when you really look into the lyrics, it feels like in your universe, Colombia descends from Europe, from the old European world.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's not 100% true, but it's obviously partly true. This country is, I think you could probably make an argument that it's the most 50-50 of the Latin American countries, 50% native stuff and 50% Spanish stuff, especially up here in the mountains. In the coast, you have the African influence as well, but up here where we're from, it's very much 50-50. And we sort of explore the indigenous side of that on Siete Lagunas, the more like the native element. But Cóndor was always more drawn to the Spanish element. And we always saw that sort of, there's two heroic enterprises in the history of Colombia as we see it, the conquest and the independence. And they were both deeply ensconced in European happenings, the Renaissance or the end of the Renaissance, and then sort of the Enlightenment, quote unquote, period, and the 19th century and Napoleon and this sort of like the great, up, I guess, uprooting of traditional Europe in a way, both for good and ill. And these men, the ones who took part in both enterprises, they both saw themselves as part of a broader sort of Western continuum. Obviously, the conquistadores, obviously, but then even the men who were behind independence, despite the fact that they were very proudly Colombian and they had good things to say about the indigenous heritage, they were, men with classical educations. They were Romans. When they wrote to each other, they would reference Greece and Rome. This was their ideological, I guess you could say, background, their philosophical sort of grounding. And I think you can't understand. Latin America without that. You can't understand it without the indigenous element either, obviously. But but to us, that sort of heroism, which is so clearly captured in a lot of European high literature and in other cultures as well, but but in European high literature, is also present in our history. And that's what kind of drove the Cóndor project from the beginning, like to find that heroism.
Mm, definitely. I mean, I also wanted to talk to you about, Siete Lagunas, which I
Mhm.
actually got as a present. Um,
What a shitty present.
no, I loved it. I ended up a funny story. So when I bought all the Condor stuff that you had at the time from David from La Caverna Records,
Yeah.
when I received the package, because it came from Colombia, there were obviously, people at
He
customs
searched
was, yes, searched. But I could tell it was the strip, for the cocaine. I was like,
it.
ah.
Yeah.
So I ended up getting Siete Lagunas, which is a really interesting project because it's like, it feels like it's the most raw and condensed form of what Condor could ever be.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I mean, obviously, they're very different, but there's inevitably similarities. I think the biggest one comes from the fact that Francisco is playing guitar in both of them. And so he has a very particular riffing style, especially. I think like you can tell which riffs in Siete Lagunas are his. And but it's a different, I mean, it's obviously the both of us, so it's also gonna have some similarities. But it's I think Cóndor, there's a sense in which I hate to use this word, but Cóndor is kind of a little cerebral. Like we think a lot about what's happening in the music. With Siete Lagunas, the idea was like let's do the complete opposite of that. Let's not think about anything. Let's just hit it. Let's go raw. And we recorded that in a rehearsal space and in my mother's shower. It was all very kind of like crudely done, very much on purpose. And I hope we keep doing it one day, but obviously right now it's not very much a possibility. But I think I like where we were going.
Because it felt just kind of like one take. These are the first ideas we have, very flowing. Almost, it reminds you of something like Iljan in the sense that, it's very direct, doesn't mess
Yeah.
around.
I mean, Ildren was an influence, but mostly sort of Vokter, his other project.
Yeah, definitely.
Ildren has a punk thing, and neither of us are very much into the punk thing. But it was sort of Vokter, but also the influence, I think, at that time, even more so than black metal, was kind of krautrock and very experimental, free improvisation kind of thing. We were like, let's do that, but us, but metal.
Yeah, yeah. I see exactly what you mean. Whereas, crowd rock had like 20-minute bass solos.
Yeah, but the spirit of it was like sort of, I think what's magical about krautrock, which is a music I love, is that it takes sort of the format, the rock band format, but then it doesn't do anything rock related, which is it is a breeding ground for creativity. Like let's take these limitations, bass, guitar, drums, but let's not do what you would expect with them. Let's do everything else, which is what I think post rock was supposed to be, but obviously is not, you know?
Yeah, uh, definitely. Um, so so what I wanted to ask you about, so I want to get a bit more into the three guitarist thing, right?
Yeah.
Because, but outside of you guys, I think Iron Maiden is the only kind of band that has done that. And personally, I found the results of that to be an absolute catastrophe. And God knows how much money they have and a big band. And anyway, don't get me into Yannick Gers's guitar solos, but
Oh, Yannick.
yeah. But how do you write for three guitars? That's really interesting to me.
So I think most of the time what happens is a riff. Obviously, most riffs just come from jamming. And then usually I will write a song front to back thinking about the three guitars. Once I have the riff, I'm like, okay, how are we going to do this? So that's my main focus at the beginning. Like, how are we going to arrange these three voices? And that doesn't mean, everyone doesn't have to play all the time. Of course, there are long sections of each song when one of us doesn't play because you don't need the three guitars all the time. But once it came in, it became quickly the dominant uh, part of the aesthetic because it's very difficult for it not to be. There is one advantage, which is that Jorge plays a seven string. So that puts him in a little bit of a different box than us. He that gives him a role in a sense. He plays the power chords. He, gives the chugs. Um, I think the reason why we can write for three guitars better now, or just in general, is because we know each other's playing. So I'm not writing for three guitars. I'm writing for Antonio, Francisco, and Jorge, and I think Francisco does the same. And that's what helps us do it. And then when there's a solo section, we talk about it. We're like, okay, who is going to do the best solo on this? Because we have very different soloing styles too. So I think that's why it works, because we know each other's playing and we write specifically with each other's playing in mind, not sort of like abstractly.
Yeah, I mean, also, here the solos have taken on, a lot more importance than all your other releases. They're really part of the kind of the narrative, the story that you guys are telling. So,
Yeah.
so how do you write a solo in that? Okay, it has to be somewhat, has to grab your attention, has to be a little bit flashy, but it also has to serve the song, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a balancing act. I think I don't write my solos. I wait for the other two guys to record theirs and then I improvise mine, because it's also a balancing act with the other solos, with what's going on in the song. So I know the one who sits down and like writes his solos note for note is Francisco. And so he always writes his solos first. And so we kind of ride around that. And he has a very shreddy style, It's not kind of like, I guess, very early shreddy style, kind of that shrapnel records thing he loves. And so we ride around that. We try not to do that, because three of those, that's too much. Um, yeah, it's mostly, you try to use melodies from the song if you can. You try to, but obviously the most important thing is like what point in the structure of the song are we in, and what does this need right now for it to justify a solo? Because, you know, we love guitar solos, obviously, but we try not to just put them there just because we can. Like we try to make sure that they're at key points in the song, because to us they're the most expressive part of heavy metal in a way. The
Mm.
guitar solo, classic guitar solo. And I think this is probably the record with the most and the longest guitar solos since the first one, since Nadia, which had a lot of very long, all improvised guitar solos. Um, yeah, we learned that from not so much from heavy metal bands, to be honest. It's like Wishbone Ash and Pink Floyd. Those are the records where like the lead guitar is the lead instrument that we learned from.
I can definitely see that. Another curious thing as well is that you have another song called Aurë Entuluva. You have two songs in
Yeah.
your discography.
Yes, we do. Well, we have a song on an album.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, well, the whole project is interconnected from day one. Like we're still, in a sense, writing about the same things, exploring these themes. Well, how long is it now? 13 years later. So
Mm.
obviously it's different, but we did that on purpose. We wanted to kind of like it brings it together. That phrase Aurë Entuluva, that's Kenya, that comes from the Silmarillion, means they will come again. And it just seemed right because, well, first of all, the band's back together after 7 years, but it's also like a thematic thing that we have with this kind of like we're more cynical in daily life than we try to be in Cóndor, or like there's a heroic aspect that we're trying to invoke. And also, I think that's just kind of cool, the kind of the cross-referencing, like it sounds like something Manowar would do, like having a reference back to the older albums or something.
Yeah. So, for some reason, I thought, Apollon Lycaon, whatever, it was called Ora Interluva because, when you
Oh
have the
yeah.
folk part, what are you singing during the?
Yeah, Aurë Entuluva. Yeah.
Me, let's talk about the folk influence. It was always there. You have that one song on the end of El Valle del Cóndor, and then
Yeah.
you have it kind of appears a bit everywhere here on that, and as well on Oración en Lebadea. So, where did that come from?
We've always been into that kind of music. I think uh Colombian folk music doesn't actually play that. We love it, but we explored that more in another side project called Osuna y Leña. Um, it's actually more sort of like Spanish folk music, especially the canciones de gesta tradition that we kind of draw from in Cóndor, which is, this very this minor key kind of like very strong riffy kind of melodies telling a story. Um, that's always been there. And also, like most metalheads, we had a neo-folk phase, and some of that still remains. Like that Ulver album, I think I still love that Ulver album, Ulver too. The guitar playing and the singing, and I think that whole dark folk thing. Tenhi was another band we were super into for a while. Vali, the instrumental band, and so that seeps into it because we like melodies. We like strong melodies. Heavy metal, classic heavy metal is a melodic genre. Folk music is obviously European and South American folk music is melodic, and so it seeps into it. It's just a good way to write melodies. And I think also indirectly from metal bands, our sense of melody also comes from bands like Viking era Bathory, who took it from folk music. So it's sort of like um, there's many pathways through which we get the folk thing.
Yeah, yeah, I could definitely see that. Funny thing, first time I listened to Cóndor because it was David, Rosales who sent it to me.
Of course.
Said, this is Colombian folk music. It goes, no, this is based on Spanish folk music.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I
yeah,
mean, they're not that different, but yeah, it's true.
yeah. So it, it's quite funny. So a lot of the songs that you've written throughout your career are long, and it feels like that's something that like metal and it's kind of like semi-underground um incarnations, right? It's become a big obsession to write long songs. But for a lot of times, it feels very masturbatory, very self-indulgent. Xasto can write a 25-minute song, whatever. But, you know, what do you think makes the difference between the way you do it and the way a lot of those bands do it?
Oof, man, I don't know. I think when a long song is bad, it's because it is this going to sound obvious, but because it didn't have to be long, because the idea could be fully expressed and developed in 3, 4, 5 minutes. I think we don't necessarily set out to write slow songs, long songs, but we have two things going for us in that department. We are mostly a slow band, that which makes things longer. And I think slower riffs, in doom metal, which is kind of like our home base in a way, uh, makes it are easier to develop in that sort of patient way that a long song requires. I think a long song, what you can't do with a long song is kind of give yourself away too quickly, like a little bit of a premature ejaculation problem. You have to wait, and you kind of have to tease people. You have to like give a little bit, but then not quite yet. You can't reach your high point, your climax. I don't want to go on with that metaphor, but you can't reach the
Yeah.
climax too quickly, or else there's no point in having the song. Obviously, if it's a really bad long song, there's just no climax, period. Like there's no, that's just, nonsense. There are exceptions, of course, especially in black metal. Like I think one of my favorite long songs is Drink the Poetry of the Celtic Disciple. And that song doesn't really follow any of those rules. It just goes on and on and on, but it can be long because it's hypnotic. What we do isn't that. What we do is like, I guess it's just honestly, the influences are so obvious, they're almost boring to mention, but it's like the long Iron Maiden songs. Like how do those work? Well, because there's a patient sort of like build up, question and answer, give and take, a slow way to somewhere. You know, that's what we try to do. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, I can completely agree from what I've heard. So, yeah. So, what are your plans for the future with Condor and any other projects?
So we're all very excited. I think we were all happy to make this record. We played two shows. I guess we played two shows on this sort of like latest revival of the band, and we were very happy to do so. I think we all love doing this, and I think that for us also as songwriters, there's still some stuff left to explore with the Condor idea. There's a lot of material written that I think is now at the stage where it needs to be consolidated into a record, into something that makes sense, into a direction. Obviously, there's that. Once you're done with a record, you kind of have to ask yourself what you want to keep from that record and what you want to not keep from that record, and what you want to bring in, etc. And to me, that's the hardest part. Like, what's the identity of this record going to be? because writing 100 riffs is a matter of time, but then making that into something coherent and good, and exciting is does require a little bit of a thought process, I think. But so we're at that stage. So 100%, I think during this year we would like to at least write album number six. Hopefully, play live if circumstances can happen. And my personal thing, on a less important ground, would be that I would love to see a vinyl pressing of the record. But may or may not happen.
Because it's funny, you've chosen a very interesting kind of like a home label, right? In La Caverna Records, who have done a phenomenal job in reissuing a lot of weird, crazy stuff. Even like Cuban death metal from the 90s, and old bands like Sepsis and all that. So I'm always keeping an eye out on what David is doing over there. But it seems like you're the only kind of current young band that isn't a reissue on that label.
There's a Finnish band too, Sadistic Drive, I think they're called.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, they're still going on. I thought they ended. Uh,
I'm not entirely sure, actually. I
yeah,
might be
yeah.
wrong.
I love
I know
the first release he
David,
did. Yeah, it was a great one.
David released that. I think, David is just, he was Cóndor's sort of first or second champion. And he's been a personal friend for a long time. He is a heavy metal encyclopedia, he knows everything. And he loves the band, and most importantly, perhaps, he's very fixated on having a high quality product. He'll go over the color scheme of the printing a dozen times, and at the time you want to kill him, but then when it's done, you're like, oh, this was worth it, because now this little testament to our work and to our ideas and to our music is of a very high quality, and that was is very important. Having in the age of streaming, the people who go out and buy a CD deserve a very good product, I think, something that is worth keeping on their shelves and, worth taking out and looking at every time you listen to. Um, so I think, he does a great job of that. Obviously, he's local, which helps. I can just go over to his house, and he's a friend and he does a great job.
That's crazy. That's great. Um, so yeah, I think we've got one last question. So
Yeah.
this is quite funny. So because I've always seen Cóndor as a very kind of subgenre agnostic band in the sense, it fits within that kind of broad tradition of death, black, extreme metal, and heavy metal influence, which quite a few bands have done. Some bands are very hard to categorize, right? But you always seem to have this doom metal thing as a base. Like, why doom metal as a base necessarily?
I think at the beginning is because we wanted to be a doom metal band, like this is a doom metal band. I guess we were just really into that music at the time. I was really into funeral doom at the time, Thurgathon, worship, skepticism. Uh, we never wanted to go that slow or that simple, but it was home base, and I think because we started there, it's just kind of like where we move most comfortably. I also think it's a genre like our music. We've always wanted it to be narrative, and I think doom metal lends itself to narrative very well. Like all good doom metal is narrative in a way, obviously Candlemass and obviously Solstice, and and even the extreme stuff, even stuff like My Dying Bride, which was a big influence at the beginning, is very narrative in the way it's written out and sort of like the patience of the development. So I think that's why it's just because it's I don't even think we're a doom metal band anymore, but we do play slow more often than we play fast, and that's because of that sort of like narrative drive that I think that allows you to explore more easily.
Definitely. All right. Well, thank you very much, Antonio. Any final words?
No, thank you, man. Thank you. I guess final words is, thank you for keeping up Hessian firm, which is such a cool space for like thinking about metal in a more musical way and in a less sort of product way. And yeah, thanks for having me on.
All right. Thanks very much.